Package org.parosproxy.paros.core.scanner. Import org.parosproxy.paros.common.abstract_param. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class scanner param extends abstract param. Private static final string scanner equals scanner. Private static final string host underscore per underscore scan equals scanner dot host per scan. Private static final string thread underscore per underscore host equals scanner dot thread per host. Private int host per scan equals 2. Private int thread per host equals 1. At param root element name. Public scanner param. Non-javadoc. At ccom proof secure.paros.common.file xml number parse. Protected void parse. Try. Se thread per host, get config, .get int, thread underscore per underscore host, 1. Catch, exception e. Try. Sthost per scan, get config, .get int, host underscore per underscore scan, 2. Catch, exception e. Public int get thread per host. Return thread per host. Public void se thread per host, int thread per host. This dot thread per host equals thread per host. Get config, dot set property, thread underscore per underscore host, integer dot tost ring, this dot thread per host. At return returns the thread. Public int get host per scan. Return host per scan. At param thread the thread to set. Public voids thost per scan, int host per scan. This dot host per scan equals host per scan. Get config, dot set property, host underscore per underscore scan, integer dot tost ring, this dot host per scan. Package org.parosproxy.paros.extension.pattern search. Import java.awt.choice. Import java.awt.frame. Import java.awt.gridbag constraints. Import java.awt.gridbag layout. Import java.awt.grid layout. Import java.awt.event.input event. Import javax.swing.border-factory. Import javax.swing.jbutton. Import javax.swing.jpanel. Import javax.swing.jRadioButton. Import javax.swing.jscrollPane. Import javax.swing.jTextArea. Import javax.swing.border.titledBorder. Import org.parosproxy.paros.extension.abstract_dialog. Import org.parosproxy.paros.extension.viewDelegate. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class search dialog extends abstract dialog. Private extension pattern search ext equals null. Private jpanel equals null. Private jpanel 1 equals null. Private jpanel 2 equals null. Private jscrollPane equals null. Private jscrollPane 1 equals null. Private jTextArea text pattern equals null. Private jTextArea text result equals null. Private jbutton btn search equals null. Private jpanel 3 equals null. Private jpanel 4 equals null. Private view delegate view equals null. Private jpanel 5 equals null. Private choice equals null. Private jRadioButton equals null. Private jRadioButton 1 equals null. Private jpanel 6 equals null. This method initializes public search dialog. Super. Initialize. Public search dialog, frame owner, boolean modal. Super, owner, modal. Initialize. This method initializes this At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set title, extract pattern in session. This dot set content pane, get jpanel. This dot set size, 561, 515. This method initializes jpanel. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel. If jpanel equals null. Grid bag constraints 5 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridBagConstraints 2 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridBagConstraints 1 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridBagConstraints 21 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 21.anchor equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 21.fill equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 5.anchor equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 5.fill equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.horizontal. Grid bag constraints 5.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,2,2,2. Grid bag constraints 5.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 5.grid equals 0. Jpanel equals new jpanel. Jpanel.set layout, new grid bag layout. Grid bag constraints 1.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 1.grid equals 1. Grid bag constraints 1.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2, 2, 2, 2. Grid bag constraints 1.anchor equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 1.fill equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.both. Grid bag constraints 1.weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 1.weighty equals 0.1d. Grid bag constraints 1.grid height equals 1. Grid bag constraints 2.gridx equals 0. Grid bag constraints 2.grid equals 2. Grid bag constraints 2.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2, 2, 2, 2. Grid bag constraints 2.anchor equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.northwest. Grid bag constraints 2.fill equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.both. Grid bag constraints 2.weights equals 1.0d. Grid bag constraints 2.weighty equals 0.9d. Grid bag constraints 2.grid height equals 1. Jpanel.add, get jpanel 1, grid bag constraints 1. Jpanel.add, get jpanel 2, grid bag constraints 2. Jpanel.add, get jpanel 6, grid bag constraints 5. Return jpanel. This method initializes jpanel 1. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel 1. If jpanel 1 equals null. Grid bag constraints 4 equals new grid bag constraints. Grid bag constraints 21 equals new grid bag constraints. Titled border 1 equals border factory dot create a tight led border, null. Enter plain text below for encoding hashing. Titled border dot default underscore justification. Titled border dot default underscore position, null, null. Java.awt.gridBagConstraints 7 equals new grid bag constraints. Java.awt.gridBagConstraints 3 equals new grid bag constraints. Jpanel 1 equals new jpanel. Jpanel 1.set layout, new grid bag layout. Jpanel 1.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 135, 100. Jpanel 1.set border, titled border 1. Grid bag constraints 3.weights equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 3.weighty equals 1.0. Grid bag constraints 3.fill equals java.awt.gridBagConstraints.both. Grid bag constraints 3. Anchor equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Northwest. Grid bag constraints 3. Grid height equals 1. Grid bag constraints 3. Grid x equals 0. Grid bag constraints 3. Grid equals 1. Grid bag constraints 3. Insets equals new java.awt. Insets 2, 2, 2, 2. Grid bag constraints 7. Anchor equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Northwest. Grid bag constraints 7. Grid x equals 1. Grid bag constraints 7. Grid equals 1. Grid bag constraints 7. Insets equals new java.awt. Insets 2, 2, 2, 2. Titled border 1. Set title, search pattern. Grid bag constraints 21. Grid x equals 0. Grid bag constraints 21. Grid equals 0. Grid bag constraints 21. Anchor equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Northwest. Grid bag constraints 21. Fill equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Horizontal. Grid bag constraints 4. Grid x equals -1. Grid bag constraints 4. Grid equals -1. Grid bag constraints 4. Weights equals 0.5 d. Grid bag constraints 4. Weight equals 1.0 d. Grid bag constraints 4. Anchor equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Northwest. Grid bag constraints 4. Fill equals java.awt. Grid bag constraints. Horizontal. Grid bag constraints 4. Insets equals new java.awt. Insets 2, 2, 2, 2. jpanel 1. Add, get jscroll pane, grid bag constraints 3. jpanel 1. Add, get jpanel 3, grid bag constraints 7. Return jpanel 1. This method initializes jpanel 2. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel 2. If jpanel 2 equals null. Titled border 2 equals javax.swing.border factory. Create a titled border. Null. Pattern search result. javax.swing.border.titledborder.default_justification. javax.swing.border.titledborder.default_position. New java.awt.font, ms sans serif. java.awt.font.plain, 11. java.awt.color.black. java.awt.gridbag constraints. Gridbag constraints 9 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints. Gridbag constraints 8 equals new gridbag constraints. jpanel 2 equals new jpanel. jpanel 2.set layout, new gridbag layout. jpanel 2.set preferred size, new java.awt.dimension, 135, 120. jpanel 2.set border, titled border 2. Gridbag constraints 8. Grid x equals 0. Gridbag constraints 8. Grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 8. Weights equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 8. Weight equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 8. Fill equals java.awt. Gridbag constraints. Both. Gridbag constraints 8. Insets equals new java.awt. Insets 2, 2, 2, 2. Gridbag constraints 8. Anchor equals java.awt. Gridbag constraints. Northwest. Gridbag constraints 8. Grid height equals 1. Gridbag constraints 9. Grid x equals 1. Gridbag constraints 9. Grid equals 0. Gridbag constraints 9. Insets equals new java.awt. Insets 2, 2, 2, 2. Gridbag constraints 9. Anchor equals java.awt. Gridbag constraints. Northwest. Titled border 2. Set title, search result. jpanel 2. Add, get jscroll pane 1, gridbag constraints 8. jpanel 2. Add, get jpanel 4, gridbag constraints 9. Return jpanel 2. This method initializes jscroll pane. At return javax.swing.jscroll pane. Private jscrollpane get jscrollpane. If jscrollpane equals null, jscrollpane equals new jscrollpane. jscrollpane.set viewport view gets pattern. jscrollpane. Dots the horizontal scroll bar policy, javax.swing.jscrollpane.horizontal underscore scroll bar underscore never. Return jscrollpane. This method initializes jscrollpane1. At return javax.swing.jscrollpane. Private jscrollpane get jscrollpane1. If jscrollpane1 equals null, jscrollpane1 equals new jscrollpane. jscrollpane1.set viewport view gets result. Return jscrollpane1. This method initializes text encode. At return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext area gets pattern. If text pattern equals null, text pattern equals new jtext area. Text pattern.set line wrap true. Text pattern.set font new java.awt.font courier new. java.awt.font.plain 12. Text pattern.add listener new java.awt.event.mouse adapter. Public void mouse pressed java.awt.event.mouse event e. If e.get modifiers and input event.button 3 underscore mask equals 0, right mouse button. View.get pop-up menu .show e.get component e.get x e.get y. Return text pattern. This method initializes text decode. At return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext area gets result. If text result equals null, text result equals new jtext area. Text result.set line wrap true. Text result.set font new java.awt.font courier new. java.awt.font.plain 12. Return text result. This method initializes thnr code. At return javax.swing.jbutton. Private jbutton get btn search. If btn search equals null, btn search equals new jbutton. btn search.set text search. btn search.set action command search. btn search.add action listener new java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed java.awt.event.action event e. Text result.set text. If text pattern.get text equals null and text pattern.get text equals text result.set text ext search text pattern.get text get jradio button is selected. Return btn search. This method initializes jpanel3. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel3. If jpanel3 equals null, java.awt.grid layout 6 equals new grid layout. jpanel3 equals new jpanel. jpanel3.set layout grid layout 6. grid layout 6.set rows 3. grid layout 6.set columns 1. grid layout 6.set vgap 3. grid layout 6.set gap 3. jpanel3.add get jradio button null. jpanel3.add get jradio button 1 null. jpanel3.add get btn search null. Return jpanel3. This method initializes jpanel4. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel4. If jpanel4 equals null, java.awt.grid layout 11 equals new grid layout. jpanel4 equals new jpanel. jpanel4.set layout grid layout 11. grid layout 11.set rows 2. grid layout 11.set columns 1. grid layout 11.set gap 2. grid layout 11.set vgap 3. Return jpanel 4. Void set view, view delegate view. This dot view equals view. At return returns the ext. Public extension pattern search get ext. Return ext. At param ext. The ext to set. Public void set ext, extension pattern search ext. This dot ext equals ext. This method initializes jpanel 5. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel 5. If jpanel 5 equals null. Jpanel 5 equals new jpanel. Jpanel 5.set layout, new grid bag layout. Jpanel 5.set border, javax.swing.border factory.create a tight lead border, null, sample patterns, javax.swing.border.titled border.default underscore justification, javax.swing.border.titled border.default underscore position, null, null. Return jpanel 5. This method initializes choice. At return java.awt.choice. Private choice get choice. If choice equals null. Choice equals new choice. Choice.add item, dash blank dash, first one is blank, don't change. Note, the item string must end with request or response. It's used to set radio buttons. Choice.add item, cookie dot. /r /n, get all cookies from request. Choice.add item, server dot. /r /n, get all server banners from response. Choice.add item, http. Get all requested URLs from request. Choice.add item, http. .php, get all requested PHP URLs from request. Choice.add item, post http. Get all post requests from request. Choice.add item listener, new java.awt.event.item listener. Public void item state changed, java.awt.event.item event e. If get choice .get selected index equals 0, first one is blank, i.e. clear pattern. Getst pattern .set text. Else string text equals get choice .get selected item. Getst pattern .set text text.substring 0 text.index of. If text ends with request. If get jradio button is selected. Get jradio button do click. Else if get jradio button 1 is selected. Get jradio button 1 do click. Return choice. This method initializes jradio button. At return javax.swing.jradio button. Private jradio button get jradio button. If jradio button equals null. Jradio button equals new jradio button. Jradio button set text request. Jradio button set selected true. Jradio button add action listener, new java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed, java.awt.event.action event e. Get jradio button set selected true. Get jradio button 1 set selected false. Jradio button add change listener, new javax.swing.event.change listener. Public void state changed, javax.swing.event.change event e. Get jradio button 1 set selected false. Return jradio button. This method initializes jradio button 1. At return javax.swing.jradio button. Private jradio button get jradio button 1. If jradio button 1 equals null. Jradio button 1 equals new jradio button. Jradio button 1 set text response. Jradio button 1 add action listener, new java.awt.event.action listener. Public void action performed, java.awt.event.action event e. Get jradio button sets elected, false. Get JRadio button 1, sets elected, true. JRadio button 1. Add change listener, new javax.swing.event.change listener. Public void state changed, javax.swing.event.change event e. Get JRadio button, sets elected, false. Return JRadio button 1. This method initializes jpanel 6. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get jpanel 6. If jpanel 6 equals null. Grid layout 7 equals new grid layout. jpanel 6 equals new jpanel. jpanel 6. Set layout, grid layout 7. jpanel 6. Set border, javax.swing.border factory.create a tight lead border, null, sample patterns, javax.swing.border.titled border.default_justification, javax.swing.border.titled border.default_position, null, null. Grid layout 7. Set rows, 1. jpanel 6. Add, get choice, null. Return jpanel 6. At javdecl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.spider. Import java.utility vector. Public class select extends tag. Private static final parser equals new parser tag, tag.select, parser tag.closing _tag_ yes. Private option equals null. Static select gets elects, string doc. Vector selects equals new vector. Parser.parse, doc. While, parser.next tag. String content equals parser.get content. String address equals parser.get address. Select equals new select. Select.build, content. Select.build address, address. Selects.add element, select. Select result equals new select selects.size. Result equals, select, selects.toArray, result. Return result. Protected void build, string content. Option equals option.get options, content. Public option get option. Return option. Package org.paros proxy.paros.core.proxy. Import java.utility vector. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http message. Import org.paros proxy.paros.network.http sender. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class sender thread implements runnable. Private HTTP message equals null. Private HTTP sender equals null. Private vector listener list equals null. Public sender thread, HTTP sender HTTP message, sender thread listener. This.http sender equals HTTP sender. This.message equals message. Listener list equals new vector, 1. Listener list.add, listener. Public void start. Thread T equals new thread, this. T.set daemon, true. Public void run. Exception X equals null. Try. Geth sender, .send and receive, geth p message. Catch, exception E. X equals E. Notify listener, geth p message, X. Private void notify listener, HTTP message, exception X. 4, int I equals 0, I listener list.size, I++. Sender thread listener equals, sender thread listener, listener list.get, I. Listener.on message receive, message, X. At return returns the message. Public HTTP message get p message. Return message. At return returns the sender. Public HTTP sender get sender. Return HTTP sender. Package org.parosproxy.paros.core.proxy. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http message. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Interface Sender Thread Listener. Public Void on Message Receive, HTTP message, exception X. Package org.parosproxy.paros.model. Import java.io.file. Import java.io.io exception. Import java.sql.sql exception. Import java.utility list. Import org.parosproxy.paros.constant. Import org.parosproxy.paros.common.file.xml. Import org.parosproxy.paros.network.http message. Import org.xml.sax exception. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class session extends file XML. Private static final string root equals session. Private static final string session underscore desk equals session desk. Private static final string session underscore ID equals session ID. Private static final string session underscore name equals session name. Private static final string path underscore session underscore desk equals root, session underscore desk. Private static final string path underscore session underscore ID equals root, session underscore ID. Private static final string path underscore session underscore name equals root, session underscore name. Other runtime members. Private model equals null. Private string file name equals. Private string session desk equals. Parameters in XML. Private long session ID equals 0. Private string session name equals. Private sitemap site tree equals null. Constructor for the current session. The current system time will be used as the session ID. At param session ID. Public session, model. Super, root. Try. Parse file, simluntiteled session.xml. Catch, sax exception e.print stack trace. Catch, io exception e.print stack trace. Add session variable here. Set sessionid, system.current to me millis. Set session name, untitled session. Set session desk. Create default object. This site tree equals sitemap.create tree, model. This model equals model. Public void discard. Try. Model.getDB, .gettable history, .delete history session, get sessioned. Catch, SQL exception e.print stack trace. At return returns the session desk. Public string get session desk. Return session desk. At return returns the session ID. Public long get sessioned. Return session ID. At return returns the name. Public string get session name. Return session name. At return returns the site tree. Public sitemap get site tree. Return site tree. At return returns the new state. Public boolean is new state. Return file name equals. Public void open, final file, final session listener callback. Thread t equals new thread, new runnable. Public void run. Exception thrown exception equals null. Try. open, file.get absolute path. Catch, exception E. Thrown exception equals E. If, callback, equals null. Callback.session opened, file, thrown exception. T.set priority, thread.norm_priority 2. T.start. Public void open, string file name, throws SQL exception, SAX exception, IO exception, exception. Readand parse file, file name. Model.getDB.close, false. Model.getDB.open, file name. This file name equals file name. History list.remove allelements. Site node new root equals new site node, sites. Site tree.set root, new root. Update history reference. List equals model.getDB.gettable history.getHistory list, get sessioned, history reference.type_manual. History reference history ref equals null. 4. Int I equals 0, I list.size, I++. Int history ID equals, integer, list.get, I.int value. Try. History ref equals new history reference, history ID. Get cid tree.add path, history ref. If, I%100 equals 99, thread.yield. Catch, exception E. Update site tree reference. List equals model.getDB.gettable history.getHistory list, get sessioned, history reference.type_spider. 4. Int I equals 0, I list.size, I++. Int history ID equals, integer, list.get, I.int value. Try. History ref equals new history reference, history ID. Get cid tree.add path, history ref. If, I%100 equals 99, thread.yield. Catch, exception E. System.gc. Protected void parse, throws exception. Long temp session it equals 0. String temp session name equals. String temp session desk equals. Use temp variable to check. Exception will be flagged if any error. Temp session it equals long parse long, get value, session_id. Temp session name equals get value, session_name. Temp session name equals get value, session_name. Set member variable after here. Session ID equals temp sessionid. Session name equals temp session name. Session desk equals temp session desk. Asynchronous call to save a session. @param file name. @param callback. Public void save, final string file name, final session listener callback. Thread T equals new thread, new runnable. Public void run. Exception thrown exception equals null. Try. Save, file name. Catch, exception E. Thrown exception equals E. If, callback, equals null. Callback.session saved, thrown exception. T.set priority, thread.norm_priority 2. T.start. Synchronous call to save a session. @param file name. @throws exception. Public void save, string file name, throws exception. Save file, file name. If, is new state. Model.movesession, file name. Else. If, this.file name equals, file name. Copy file to new file name. Model.copy session, this.file name, file name. This.file name equals file name. Synchronized, site tree. Save cid tree, site node, site tree.getRoot. Model.getDB.gettable session.update, get sessioned, get session name. @param session desk the session desk to set. Public void set session desk, string session desk. This.session desk equals session desk. Set value, path_session_desk, session desk. At param session ID the session ID to set. Public void set sessionid, long session ID. This dot session ID equals session ID. Set text, session underscore ID, long tossed ring, session ID. Set value, path underscore session underscore ID, long tossed ring, session ID. At param name the name to set. Public void set session name, string name. This dot session name equals name. Set text, session underscore name, name. Set value, path underscore session underscore name, name. Public string get file name. Return file name. Private void save site tree, site node node. HTTP message equals null. If node dot is root. If node dot gethister reference dot gethister write type 0. VE means to be saved. Save anatomsk message. 4. Int I equals 0. I node dot get child count I plus plus. Try. Save site tree, site node, node dot get child at I. Catch, exception E. Private void save anatomsk, HTTP message. Nothing need to be done. Public string get session folder. String result equals. If, file name dot equals. Result equals constant dot folder underscore session. Result equals constant dot get instance, dot folder underscore session. Else. File equals new file, file name. Result equals file dot get parent. Return result. Package org.paros proxy.paros.extension. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.session. To change the template for this generated type comment go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Interface Session Changed Listener. Session changed may be called by non-event thread. Should handle with care in all the listener. Use event thread for each GUI event. At param session. Public void session changed, session. Package org.paros proxy.paros.view. Import java.awt.frame. Import java.awt.headless exception. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.session. To change the template for this generated type comment go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class session dialog extends abstract param dialog. Private session equals null. Public session dialog. Super. Initialize. At param parent. At param modal. At param title. At throws headless exception. Public session dialog, frame parent, boolean modal, string title. Throws headless exception. Super, parent, modal, title, session. Initialize. Public session dialog, frame parent, boolean modal, string title, string root name. Super, parent, modal, title, root name. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set size, 500, 375. At javdecl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.paros proxy.paros.view. Import javax.swing.jpanel. Import javax.swing.jlabel. Import javax.swing.jtextfield. Import javax.swing.jtextArea. Import org.paros proxy.paros.model.session. Import java.awt.gridbag layout. Import java.awt.gridbag constraints. Import java.awt.card layout. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public class session general panel extends abstract param panel. Private jpanel panel session equals null, at javdicl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,320. Private jtext field text session name equals null. Private jtext area text description equals null. Private session equals null. Public session general panel. Super. Initialize. At param parent. At param modal. At param title. At throws headless exception. Private static final string root equals. Private static final string general equals general. Private static final string miscellaneous equals miscellaneous. This method initializes this. At return void. Private void initialize. This dot set layout, new card layout. This dot set name, general. This dot add, get panel session, dot get name. This method initializes panel session. At return javax.swing.jpanel. Private jpanel get panel session. If panel session equals null. Gridbag constraints 2 equals new gridbag constraints. Panel session equals new jpanel. javax.swing.jlabel equals new jlabel. javax.swing.jlabel 1 equals new jlabel. java.awt.gridbag constraints 9 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 10 equals new gridbag constraints. java.awt.gridbag constraints 11 equals new gridbag constraints. Panel session.set layout, new gridbag layout. jlabel.set text, session name. jlabel1.set text, description. Gridbag constraints 9.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 9.grid equals 1. Gridbag constraints 9.weights equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 9.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 9.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,0,2,0. Gridbag constraints 9.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 10.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 10.grid equals 2. Gridbag constraints 10.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,0,2,0. Gridbag constraints 10.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Gridbag constraints 10.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.horizontal. Gridbag constraints 11.gridx equals 0. Gridbag constraints 11.grid equals 3. Gridbag constraints 11.weights equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 11.weighty equals 1.0. Gridbag constraints 11.fill equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.both. Gridbag constraints 11.insets equals new java.awt.insets, 2,0,2,0. Gridbag constraints 11.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Panel session.set name, general. Panel session.set size, 180, 101. Gridbag constraints 2.anchor equals java.awt.gridbag constraints.northwest. Panel session.add, jlabel, gridbag constraints 2. Panel session.add, gets session name, gridbag constraints 9. Panel session.add, jlabel 1, gridbag constraints 10. Panel session.add, gets description, gridbag constraints 11. Return panel session. This method initializes text session name. At return javax.swing.jtext field. Private jtext field gets session name. If text session name equals null. Text session name equals new jtext field. Return text session name. This method initializes text description. At return javax.swing.jtextArea. Private jTextArea gets description. If text description equals null. Text description equals new jTextArea. Text description.setBorder, javax.swing.borderFactory.createBevelBorder, javax.swing.border.bevelBorder.lowered. Text description.setLineWrap, true. Text description.setFont, new java.awt.font, dialog, java.awt.font.plain, 11. Return text description. Public void init param, object obj. Session equals, session, obj. Gets session name, dot set text, session dot get session name. Gets description, dot set text, session dot get session desk. Public void validate param, object obj. No validation needed. Public void save param, object obj, throws exception. Session equals, session, obj. Session.set session name, gets session name, dot get text. Session.set session desk, gets description, dot get text. At javdecl index equals 0 visual constraint equals 10,10. Package org.paros proxy.paros.model. Import java.io.file. To change the template for this generated type comment, go to Window, Preferences, Java, Code Generation, Code and Comments. Public Interface Session Listener. Callback method when a session was opened. At param e equals exception thrown during session opening. Null equals no exception. Public void session opened, file, exception e. Callback method when a session was saved. At param e equals exception thrown during session opening. Null equals no exception. Public void session saved, exception e.